In the sun-scorched town of Sagebrush Hollow, Clint Eastwood, the legendary gunslinger of a bygone era, now lives in peaceful solitude. His land is everything he has left from his past. But when a ruthless gang of bandits led by the notorious outlaw Rayner Shaw threatens to take it from him, they don't know they're about to face a man whose legendary skills haven't dulled with age. What happens next will turn the town into a battleground, and these criminals will regret ever crossing Clint Eastwood. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down on Sagebrush Hollow, an unremarkable town in the heart of Western America. A quiet, dusty place where the earth seemed to rise in swirls of red and brown as if the land itself was trying to escape its own history. Clint Eastwood sat on his porch, eyes hidden behind the rim of his wide-brimmed hat. His once sharp features had softened with age, but his mind, still sharp as a knife, didn't miss a single detail of his surroundings. The wind picked up slightly, dust swirling, as he puffed on a cigar, the scent of it mingling with the dry air. He'd long given up on the idea of retiring from the fight. His hands, still steady despite his years, gripped the cold steel of his gun every morning as if it were second nature. Clint had lived here for over a decade now, far removed from the world that once demanded so much of him. The town itself was small, but it had grown on him. It wasn't much, but it was home, and the land that stretched out before him was his. It was the last thing he had left after the wars, the gunfights, and the long years that came before. But trouble, like always, had a way of finding him. Rayner Shaw and his band of ruthless outlaws had come to town a week ago, and the stench of their greed had been thick ever since. Shaw was known for his cruelty and his iron grip on anyone foolish enough to cross him. Word had it that the gang had set their eyes on Clint's land, a plot of property so valuable that even the hardest men could be tempted to steal it. The town knew Clint wasn't the same man he used to be. Age had dulled his reflexes, they said. His face, etched with time, was a far cry from the fearless gunslinger of legend. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew Clint Eastwood didn't need to be young to be deadly. The first sign of the bandits came in the form of a low rumble. Dust rose in thick clouds as the gang rode in, 10 strong. They came through the outskirts of town on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the sun, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Clint didn't move. He watched them closely. They stopped just shy of his porch, as if the land itself had whispered a warning to them. Rayner Shaw himself was at the front, a hulking man with a scar running from his chin to his ear, eyes cold as steel. He dismounted first, his boots kicking up dirt as he approached Clint's porch. Clint Eastwood. Shaw's voice was gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "We've been looking for you." Clint didn't respond immediately. He merely took another long draw from his cigar, the ember glowing briefly before he blew the smoke out into the air. "I don't take kindly to being sought out, Shaw," Clint said, his voice low, his tone steady. "What do you want?" Shaw grinned, showing a row of crooked teeth. "What I want is simple. Your land. It's worth more than your life, Eastwood. And I'm a man who knows what's worth fighting for." Clint's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. His hand hovered just above the worn handle of his revolver, though he gave no indication of making a move just yet. Shaw's men spread out, eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. They thought Clint was an old man, no longer capable of a real fight. They were wrong. "You're a fool, Shaw," Clint muttered. "No one takes what isn't theirs, not on my watch." Shaw's grin faltered for a moment, but then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "That's where you're wrong, old man. I'm gonna give you a choice. Either you hand it over now, or we take it from your cold, dead hands." The air seemed to grow still. Clint's mind worked quickly, assessing the situation. Shaw had made the first move, and Clint could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could have walked away, but he knew if he did, the gang would terrorize the town. They'd steal from everyone, take what they wanted, and leave destruction in their wake. No, this wasn't about just his land. This was about something bigger. Clint finally stood, the sound of his chair scraping the porch planks loud in the silence. His fingers grazed the grip of his revolver, and for the briefest moment, the weight of his decision became a sharp, clear reality. This was it. The storm had come to his door, and he wasn't about to back down. The bandits saw his movement and tensed, hands inching toward their own weapons. Clint, however, was already ready. The tension in the air thickened, as heavy as the midday heat. The bandits shifted on their feet, eyes locked on Clint Eastwood, waiting for him to make his move. Rayner Shaw, though, was the first to act. "Draw," Shaw shouted, his hand moving like lightning, but Clint's reflexes, though aged, were still as sharp as a rattlesnake strike. In the same instant, Clint's revolver was in his hand, the barrel aimed straight at Shaw's chest. The sound of the gunshot cracked through the silence like a thunderclap, echoing off the distant hills. The bandits flinched, but Shaw remained standing, his eyes wide in shock. The bullet had grazed his coat, the near miss a warning shot that made the outlaw leader's breath hitch. Clint didn't hesitate. He knew Shaw was quick, but Clint had the advantage. Years of experience had taught him patience. Shaw's hand shook ever so slightly as he steadied his gun, but Clint's focus remained absolute. The standoff continued in tense silence, Clint's eyes never leaving Shaw's. The wind kicked up again, swirling dust around them in small cyclones. Shaw's men muttered under their breath, uneasy about the sudden change in the situation. Clint spoke, his voice low but firm. "You've made a mistake, Shaw. I don't just fight for land. I fight for the people who live here. You'll learn that soon enough." For a split second, Clint could see Shaw's lip curl in anger before he barked orders to his gang. "Get him." That was all Clint needed. The bandits charged forward, drawing their weapons, but Clint was faster. The first two men didn't even see it coming. In one fluid motion, Clint's gun flashed from his hip, and the two outlaws dropped, their bodies hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The others hesitated, stunned by how quickly their comrades were taken down. Shaw roared in fury, realizing that Clint was still every bit the legend that had earned him his reputation. He reached for his own gun, but Clint was already one step ahead. With a precise, calculated move, Clint ducked low, sidestepping Shaw's shot as it tore through the air above him. Clint's revolver rang out again, and Shaw's gun flew from his hand, landing several feet away. "You're done, Shaw," Clint said, the finality in his voice unmistakable. He stepped forward, keeping his weapon aimed at the outlaw leader, who stood frozen, fear flashing in his eyes. Shaw gritted his teeth, then raised his hands in defeat. "I should have known better than to challenge you, Eastwood." Clint didn't lower his gun, though. "You should have known a lot of things, Shaw. One of them being not to mess with people who have something worth protecting." The remaining bandits, witnessing their leader's surrender, began to back away, their hands slowly rising in a show of submission. Clint kept his eyes on them, ensuring they had no thoughts of pulling any tricks. With the fight over, the air became still once more, the sounds of horses' hooves and the occasional breeze the only noise that remained. Clint holstered his revolver, his movements slow and deliberate, but his gaze never leaving the defeated outlaws. Shaw, on his knees, grunted in frustration. "You may have won this fight, Eastwood, but there's more of us. You can't keep us all away forever." Clint's steely gaze met Shaw's. "I don't need to keep you all away. Just need to make sure the ones who come don't forget what happened to you." With a final sneer, Shaw spat on the ground, clearly defeated. Clint wasn't the same gunslinger he used to be, but there was something in his eyes that told Shaw he didn't want to test him again. "You're not the man you once were," Shaw muttered under his breath, "but you're still dangerous, and that's something I'll respect." Clint didn't respond to that, nor did he need to. The message was clear. Rayner Shaw had underestimated him, and it had cost him dearly. The bandits, now cowed and wary, mounted their horses and slowly turned to leave, the weight of their failure heavy in the air. As they disappeared into the horizon, Clint watched them go, his hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver. The fight was over, for now, but Clint Eastwood knew better than anyone that peace in the West never lasted long. Still, in this moment, it was enough. He had defended his land, his town, and his legacy, and that, Clint knew, was all that mattered. The town of Sagebrush Hollow, once filled with the noise of anxious whispers and the tension of impending violence, now seemed eerily calm. The bandits were gone, their defeat still fresh on everyone's minds. But the town wasn't naive enough to believe that the threat was over. In the Wild West, peace was only ever temporary. Clint Eastwood stood in the middle of the street, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for something, anything, that might indicate more trouble. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dust across the empty roads, but the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. The heat of the day was fading, but Clint still felt the weight of the battle pressing on his shoulders. As Clint made his way back to his porch, the people of the town slowly began to emerge from their homes. They had watched the entire ordeal from behind closed windows, hiding in fear of the violence that had nearly torn their peaceful lives apart. But now, they stepped forward, cautiously at first, to thank the man who had saved them all. An old woman, Mrs. Hawkins, who ran the general store, was the first to approach him. She had always admired Clint from afar, and despite his reputation as a cold, unfeeling gunfighter, she had seen the softer side of him over the years. "Thank you, Clint," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Clint gave a slow nod but said nothing. He wasn't one for words, especially not when there was still work to be done. He watched as she shuffled back to the others, who had gathered near the saloon, murmuring among themselves. They were relieved, but they also knew the price that had been paid for their safety. Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see Deputy Sam Carter, the only lawman left in the town, walking toward him. Sam was a good kid, young and idealistic, but Clint knew that there was little room for such things in the lawless land of the West. "You did it, Clint," Sam said, his voice tinged with admiration. "You saved us all." Clint looked down at him, a faint hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It ain't over yet, Sam. Shaw's gone, but he ain't the only one out there who'd take what's not theirs." Sam shifted uneasily, his eyes darting around the town. "What do we do now?" Clint took a long drag from his cigar, blowing the smoke out slowly, his gaze turning to the horizon once more. "Now, we wait. But we're ready. This town's got a chance now, but only if we stay vigilant." Sam nodded, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the harsh reality of life in Sagebrush Hollow. He had always admired Clint, but the weight of leadership was a burden he wasn't sure he was ready for. Clint could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the fear of what could come next. "Listen, Sam," Clint said, his tone suddenly serious. "You've got to be ready for whatever comes next. The West doesn't let up. There'll always be someone else looking to take what you've got. You've got to stand tall, and you've got to be strong. Don't let your guard down, no matter how quiet it gets." Sam swallowed hard, nodding again. Clint knew the kid had a lot to learn, but he wasn't the one to teach him all the lessons the West had to offer. The town would have to find its own way, and if they were lucky, they'd have time to rebuild, to grow stronger. Just then, Clint heard the sound of hooves. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of a lone rider approaching from the distance. The rider was silhouetted against the setting sun, and Clint's instincts immediately went on alert. He didn't recognize the horse, and the rider wasn't wearing the same colors as the previous gang. "Looks like we're not alone just yet," Clint muttered to himself, his hand instinctively drifting toward his revolver once more. The rider came closer, and Clint could now see it was a man, dressed in a long, dust-covered coat. He had a hat pulled low over his face, but his posture suggested that he was no stranger to danger. As he came into view, Clint could see the glint of a badge on his chest. A lawman. The man pulled his horse to a stop in front of Clint, tipping his hat slightly. "Clint Eastwood," the man said, his voice gravelly but authoritative. "I've heard a lot about you." Clint raised an eyebrow, still keeping his hand near his gun, but not drawing it just yet. "I don't make a habit of speaking to men who wear badges." The lawman smirked slightly. "I ain't here to arrest you, Eastwood. Far from it. I'm here to make sure the job's done. The name's Sheriff Grayson. You've caused quite a stir down here. The whole area's buzzing about what happened with Shaw and his gang." Clint studied him for a moment, sizing up the sheriff. I've done what needed doing. Can't say I'm worried about the buzz." Grayson's eyes hardened slightly, but there was a hint of respect in his voice. "Well, I'm here to tell you that there are others who'll come looking. Shaw was just one of many. You might have made an example out of him, but the rest of his crew won't forget. There's more trouble brewing." Clint didn't flinch. "I'll be ready." Grayson nodded slowly, then spurred his horse forward. "Stay sharp, Eastwood. The West isn't as quiet as it seems." As the sheriff rode off into the distance, Clint stood there for a moment longer, contemplating the weight of Grayson's words. The battle had been won, but the war for Sagebrush Hollow was far from over. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now, not ever. Clint Eastwood wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. Nightfall came quickly in Sagebrush Hollow, as it always did, with the sun dipping low into the desert horizon. Clint sat alone on his porch, the quiet hum of the evening broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The last of the townspeople had gone back to their homes, grateful but anxious, and the streets now felt as still as the dry earth beneath Clint's boots. He had been in more than his fair share of standoffs, gunfights, and battles over the years, but this felt different. The quiet after the storm always brought its own kind of tension, a kind of uneasy peace that could be shattered by the slightest noise. Clint had lived through that, and it had never been kind to him. His mind was still on Sheriff Grayson's words. Clint knew the man had a point. Shaw had been one of many, and there were always others lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The West had a way of chewing up men like Shaw, but it was also relentless in creating more men just like him. Clint had never been able to escape that fact. A soft sound reached his ears, the faint thud of hooves against the dirt. It was distant at first, but it grew louder as it approached. Clint didn't move, didn't even blink. He had been expecting this, ever since Grayson had warned him. The horse and rider came into view, a shadow in the darkness. It was a lone rider, and something about the way the horse moved made Clint uneasy. It wasn't the clumsy pace of someone unprepared. It was purposeful, controlled. The rider slowed as he reached the edge of Clint's property, his figure a silhouette in the dim light. Clint's fingers twitched near his holster, but he didn't draw just yet. He wasn't sure who this was, but he knew it wasn't just another curious traveler. The man stopped his horse just a few yards away, tipping his hat forward slightly. "Clint Eastwood?" The voice was low, with a hint of a drawl, but there was something in it that made Clint pause. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who knew him. Clint didn't reply immediately. Instead, he scanned the man's features carefully. Lean build, dark eyes, and the unmistakable air of someone who had seen more than their fair share of trouble. His face was familiar, though Clint couldn't place it just yet. The man spoke again, more quietly this time. "I'm looking for someone. Someone who knows how to handle trouble." Clint's hand hovered over the revolver again, but he didn't draw. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, regarding the man with a steady gaze. "You found him. But what makes you think I'm the man you're looking for?" The rider dismounted, his movements smooth and practiced. "I've been sent by someone who wants to talk to you. Someone who knows what happened with Shaw and his crew. They think you might be useful." Clint raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Who are they?" The rider hesitated, looking around the darkened town before meeting Clint's eyes. "Let's just say they have their eyes on the West, and on you, Clint. They've been watching you for a while now, and they think you're the kind of man who could help them out." Clint was quiet for a moment, letting the words sink in. The West was a land of secrets, and Clint had spent much of his life running from them. But if someone was looking to make use of him, there was only one way to find out what they wanted. "Who sent you?" Clint asked, his voice sharp. The rider's eyes flickered for a brief moment before he answered. "You wouldn't know the name, but you've heard the rumors. It's a group, a coalition of sorts. They're interested in things that go beyond petty gang wars or land grabs. They've got bigger plans for this part of the country." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Sounds like more trouble to me." The rider smirked, though there was no humor in it. "That's what they told me you'd say. But this isn't just about trouble, it's about control. They want you on their side, Clint. The question is, are you interested in making a difference?" Clint didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, running through every possibility, every angle. It was rare for someone to come seeking him out for any reason other than to either settle an old score or try to use him as a tool. Both options had their costs, and Clint wasn't one to throw his lot in with anyone unless he knew exactly what they were offering and what they were willing to take in return. Finally, he spoke. I've seen enough men come and go to know when someone's hiding something. You came all this way, and now you want to talk business. So here's the deal. I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing unless you tell me who's pulling the strings. The writer hesitated, then exhaled slowly. You're stubborn, Eastwood. I'll give you that. But fine. You've got your answer. The people I work for, they call themselves the Syndicate. They're looking to take control of this region. Shaw was just a pawn. They want someone who can handle themselves, someone who knows how to make the West listen. Clint's eyes grew cold at the mention of the Syndicate. The name rang a bell, though it was faint. He had heard rumors, whispers of a shadow organization pulling the strings behind the curtain, manipulating events for their own gain. Clint didn't trust anyone who operated in the shadows, least of all a group with plans so far-reaching. I'm not a pawn, and I don't take orders from anyone, Clint said, his voice ice-cold. If your Syndicate wants me, they'll have to come to me themselves. The writer looked disappointed, but he didn't back down. I thought you might say that. But I'll tell you this, if you're not with them, you're against them. And that doesn't usually end well for men like you. Clint stood up, his boots scraping against the wooden porch as he made his way toward the writer. I've been against people like them my whole life. And I've survived. The writer looked at Clint for a long moment before he mounted his horse. You'll regret this, Eastwood. I can't say I didn't warn you. Without another word, the writer spurred his horse and rode off into the darkness, leaving Clint alone with his thoughts. Clint watched him go, his mind working over the new information. The Syndicate. If they were behind Shaw's gang, they were more dangerous than anything he'd faced before. And if they thought they could control him, they had another thing coming. The storm was far from over. The night felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of Clint's thoughts. The Syndicate. That name had set off a string of alarms in Clint's mind. He'd heard rumors about powerful groups like them, men and women who pulled the strings from the shadows, working in ways that twisted the world to their will. But he had never thought one would come knocking on his door. Clint sat back down on the porch, staring at the stars overhead. The desert sky was a vast expanse of endless black, dotted with tiny pinpricks of light. He had spent his life fighting for freedom. The kind of freedom that came from knowing who your enemy was, from having control over your own fate. But these people, this Syndicate, played a different game. And Clint had a sinking feeling that they were a force he couldn't ignore. His mind wandered back to the writer's words. If you're not with them, you're against them. That wasn't a warning, it was a threat. And Clint didn't take kindly to threats. The wind picked up again, and Clint could hear the faint creak of the wood as the porch swayed in the breeze. It was quiet, too quiet. But that didn't last long. Clint stood, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand resting on the familiar weight of his revolver. He wasn't sure what came next. The Syndicate's reach was far, and if they had already gotten to Shaw, they were probably deeper in this part of the West than anyone realized. He had dealt with gangs and outlaws, but the Syndicate was something else entirely. They didn't operate on a level Clint was used to. No simple robbery, no territorial fights over land. The Syndicate had power, influence, and they weren't afraid to use them. Clint had been a lone wolf for a long time, but something told him he couldn't face them alone. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the porch. A figure appeared in the doorway, a familiar face. It was Deputy Sam Carter, his young face looking worn and weary from the recent events. But there was a resolve in his eyes that hadn't been there before. You're still up, Sam said, his voice tired but steady. I thought you might be. Clint gave a curt nod, acknowledging the deputy without speaking. Sam stood there for a moment before he spoke again. You're thinking about the Syndicate, aren't you? Clint's gaze flickered to Sam, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long drag from his cigar, the embers glowing briefly in the night's darkness. I've dealt with a lot of scum, Sam, Clint said finally, his voice low. But these folks, there's something else. I can feel it in my bones. They won't let up. and they won't stop until they get what they want. Sam shifted uneasily, his hands hanging by his sides. So what now? Do we just wait for them to come after us? Clint shook his head slowly. We don't wait, but we don't go charging in blindly either. We need to make sure we know exactly who we're dealing with before we do anything. Sam looked out into the darkness, his brow furrowed. I've heard rumors, too. Some folks say the Syndicate's been involved in everything from cattle rustling to train robberies to sabotaging railroads. They have their hands in a lot of pies. Clint's gaze darkened, his eyes narrowing, and they're going to keep reaching for more. Clint knew that the Syndicate's power wasn't just in their numbers or their wealth. It was in their ability to control everything around them, to manipulate people and events from behind the scenes. Shaw's gang had been just the tip of the iceberg. What Clint had seen so far, quick, deadly encounters with ruthless men and women, was nothing compared to what the Syndicate could do if they were really pulling the strings. We can't fight them alone, Sam, Clint said, his voice rough with a sense of finality. This is bigger than Sagebrush Hollow. If we're going to make a stand, we need help. We need allies. Sam looked uncertain, his youthful optimism tempered by the grim realization that Clint was right. Who do we turn to, Clint? Where do we even start? Clint didn't answer right away. He had a few ideas. Some old friends, old allies who owed him a favor, some who might be willing to stand beside him against this unseen enemy. But they weren't easy to reach, and some might not even still be alive. We start by finding out who's in charge of the Syndicate, Clint said, his tone firm. Once we know who we're up against, then we can figure out how to bring them down. Sam nodded slowly. I'll help you however I can. I've seen what these kinds of people can do, and I won't let them tear this town apart. Clint gave him a sharp look. You're sure about this? Sam met his gaze, his voice unwavering. Yes. You saved this town once, Clint. I think it's time we both did our part. Clint studied him for a moment longer before giving a slow nod. The kid wasn't ready for everything the West could throw at him, but he had heart. Clint could respect that. All right, Sam, Clint said, standing up. Tomorrow, we start looking for answers. And when we find them, we make sure the Syndicate knows that they made a big mistake coming here. The two men stood together on the porch, the weight of what lay ahead settling in their bones. The night was still, but the storm was coming. The Syndicate had made their move, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let them win. The morning sun had barely broken over the hills when Clint Eastwood and Deputy Sam Carter set out from Sagebrush Hollow. The town had returned to its quiet rhythms, but Clint knew better than to think the danger had passed. He'd seen enough of the world to understand that shadows never left completely. They just lingered, waiting for their moment. They rode out of town, heading for the small outpost known as Crosswind Ranch, a place where old friends of Clint's still lived, a couple of former lawmen who might be able to help them gather the information they needed on the Syndicate. Clint knew that if anyone could point them in the right direction, it would be these two men. The day was hot already, the desert sun burning overhead. The heat shimmered on the horizon, making the landscape seem like it was moving. Sam rode alongside Clint, his eyes sharp but still carrying the weight of their conversation the night before. The kid had never been one for the shadows, and Clint could see the nervousness in his every movement. You sure about this? Clint asked, glancing at Sam as they rode in silence. I mean, this is deeper than anything you've dealt with. Sam adjusted his hat, his voice steady despite the doubt Clint could see in his eyes. I'm with you, Clint. I've seen what the Syndicate can do. If they're really pulling the strings here, we need to stop them. If we don't, who will? Clint nodded, though there was no smile on his face. He'd seen too many good men get caught up in things they didn't understand, thinking they could handle it on their own. This was different. The Syndicate wasn't like the gangs or the outlaws Clint had faced. They had connections, power, and influence. They weren't just fighting for land or money. They were playing a long game. And Clint didn't trust that kind of power. The ranch wasn't far from Sagebrush Hollow, just a couple of hours' ride. But by the time they arrived, Clint felt the familiar weight of anticipation settling in his gut. Crosswind Ranch was a sprawling piece of land, dotted with low-slung buildings and corrals filled with horses. It looked peaceful, but Clint knew it wouldn't take much to turn this place into another battleground. As they rode up to the main house, Clint saw two men standing by the porch. Both were older, weathered by years of living in the harsh landscape of the West, but their eyes were sharp. One of them, a man named Ben Hargrave, had once been Clint's partner during a run-in with the law, and the other, Gabe Hunter, had worked alongside Clint during a time when outlaws had nearly overrun the region. Ben gave Clint a knowing look as they approached, tipping his hat. "I thought I might see you again soon, Eastwood," he said, his voice gravelly from years of hard living. "Good to see you, Ben." "Gabe," Clint responded, nodding to the other man. "We need to talk." Gabe stepped forward, his expression guarded. "What's this about, Clint? You've been off the grid for a while now." Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm looking for information. I've got trouble coming my way, and it's got a name. The Syndicate." Ben and Gabe exchanged a glance, and Clint saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes. They knew exactly what he was talking about. "The Syndicate, huh?" Ben said slowly. "They've been a shadow over the West for years now. People don't talk about them much, but everyone knows they're there. You wouldn't believe half the stories I've heard about them." Clint didn't flinch. He had already heard enough to understand what kind of power the Syndicate wielded. But now, he needed specifics. He needed names, faces, and any weaknesses they might have. "I need to know who's running the show," Clint said. "I need to know who's behind the curtain." Shaw was just a pawn, but he wasn't alone. The Syndicate's got their hands in everything. Ben rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You're right about that. They've been moving in on territories all over the West. And they don't just use guns. They use influence, money, anything they can get their hands on. But getting close to them, well, that's not something you can do alone." Clint's jaw tightened. "I know that. That's why I'm here." Gabe spoke up then, his tone cautious. "There's a man, Lyall Stanton. He's one of their key players. Runs a saloon up in Elmsford. Used to be a small-time operator, but in the last couple of years, he's grown. Word is, he's got connections that go deeper than anyone's willing to admit." Sam shifted in the saddle beside Clint. "How do we get to him?" Ben raised an eyebrow. "That's the tricky part. Stanton's not exactly a friendly fellow. He keeps his dealings quiet, but he's tied up with some dangerous people. If you're serious about going after him, you'll need more than just a plan. You'll need muscle and you'll need to move fast." Clint nodded grimly. "I'm not looking to fight a war. I'm looking to get answers. If Stanton's got connections to the Syndicate, then he's my way in." Gabe stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with concern. "You'll need to be careful, Clint. This isn't the same kind of fight you're used to. These people play dirty, and they don't take kindly to people poking around in their business." Clint's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his side. "I've fought dirtier," Ben sighed. "I know you have. And that's why I'm telling you this. You've got to be smart about this. You can't just charge in like you used to. Not this time." Clint looked from Ben to Gabe, both of them watching him carefully. He had known them long enough to trust their judgment, but this was different. There was no turning back from this fight, and Clint needed to be sure he wasn't stepping into something that would swallow him whole. "I'll go to Elmsford," Clint said finally, his voice resolute. "I'll find Stanton, and I'll find out what I need to know. If the Syndicate's behind this, then they're the ones who'll answer for it." Gabe and Ben exchanged another look, then nodded. "Be careful," Gabe said. "And remember, you don't know who you can trust when it comes to the Syndicate." Clint gave them a brief nod of acknowledgement. "I've always known that." With that, Clint and Sam turned their horses and rode out, heading toward Elmsford. The road ahead was dangerous, but Clint had faced worse. If the Syndicate wanted a fight, they'd get one. But Clint wasn't just after revenge. He was after something more. He was after the truth. And nothing, not even the shadows of the West, was going to stop him from finding it. The ride to Elmsford took longer than Clint had expected. The sun had begun to set when the town finally came into view, a small settlement nestled at the base of a range of jagged hills. Dust rose in the air like a thick veil, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood and the distant call of coyotes. Clint had been through places like this before. Small towns, forgotten by time and barely touched by civilization. They were the kind of places where the law didn't hold sway, where outlaws and people with more dangerous interests could slip in unnoticed. And that's exactly what made Elmsford the perfect place for a man like Lyall Stanton to operate. The saloon was easy enough to spot. It was the largest building in the center of town, a two-story structure with a sign that hung crookedly above the door, the Silver Spur. The windows were darkened, and there was a steady murmur of voices coming from inside. It looked like business was thriving. Clint pulled his horse to a stop in front of the saloon and dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. Sam followed suit, his eyes scanning the street warily. They had come to find Stanton, but Clint knew better than to think that things would be simple. The Syndicate didn't take kindly to people asking questions, and if Lyall Stanton was really involved with them, Clint would be walking into the lion's den. The doors to the saloon swung open as Clint stepped forward, and the low hum of conversation died down for a moment as the patrons looked up at the two strangers who had just entered. Clint scanned the room, noting the grim faces of the men and women who filled the tables. Most of them looked like the type who had been around long enough to know how to survive in a place like this. No one here would hesitate to pull a gun if things went south. At the bar, a man with a thick beard and a scar running across his cheek looked up at Clint and Sam. He had the air of someone who was more than just a bartender. He was part of something bigger. "You here for a drink, or you here for something else?" the bartender asked, his voice rough and low. Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "I'm looking for Lyall Stanton. I hear he runs this place." The bartender's eyes narrowed, and Clint saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze. Stanton's name carried weight here, and not the kind of weight anyone wanted to deal with. "You looking to make trouble?" the bartender asked, his tone suddenly sharper. "No," Clint replied, his voice calm and even. "I'm just looking for answers. I need to speak to Stanton." The bartender studied Clint for a long moment before he finally nodded, though there was no warmth in his gesture. "Upstairs. But don't make too much noise. Lyall doesn't take kindly to visitors without an appointment." Clint nodded, and with a glance at Sam, he started toward the stairs in the back corner of the room. The eyes of the patrons followed them, some of them watching with interest, others with the wary calculation of men who knew exactly what could happen when strangers came looking for trouble. As they ascended the stairs, Clint's hand drifted toward the grip of his revolver, not because he expected trouble immediately, but because he knew it was always close by in places like this. The door at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar, and Clint could hear voices from within. A man's voice, low and smooth, and a woman's, sharp and irritated. They were talking, but Clint couldn't make out the words. He paused outside the door, signaling Sam to stay silent. Clint pushed the door open just a crack, peering inside. Lyall Stanton was sitting behind a large desk, his back to the door, his hands steepled in front of him as he spoke to the woman across from him. She had short, dark hair and wore a black dress that marked her as someone who knew how to move through the world without drawing attention, but Clint could tell that she was no ordinary townsperson. There was a dangerous edge to her, something cold in the way she carried herself. Clint's instincts flared. He had learned over the years to read people, to know when someone was dangerous, and this woman had danger written all over her. Stanton, on the other hand, was the very picture of calm, too calm. He was younger than Clint expected, with sharp features and a face that was both handsome and cruel. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention, even when he wasn't speaking. Clint listened carefully as Stanton spoke again, his voice smooth like velvet, but with an undercurrent of menace that Clint could hear even from the doorway. "Tell your people to stay quiet. We've got a lot riding on this deal. The last thing we need is for anyone to make a scene." The woman's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And if they don't listen?" Stanton smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Then we handle it. The Syndicate doesn't leave loose ends." Clint's mind raced as he listened. The Syndicate. It was no surprise that Stanton was tied up with them. He had the kind of demeanor that seemed to thrive in the shadows, in the spaces where power was quietly exchanged. Clint pushed the door open a little wider, enough to step into the room, his boots silent against the wooden floor. Stanton's head snapped toward the door, his eyes narrowing when he saw Clint standing there. The woman beside him reached for a pistol that was holstered at her side, but Clint's hand was faster. His revolver was already in his hand, aimed directly at her. Stanton stood slowly, his hands raised in a show of calm, but Clint could see the tension in his posture. He wasn't worried. Not yet, but he was sizing Clint up. "You must be Clint Eastwood," Stanton said, his voice laced with an almost casual interest. "I've heard a lot about you." Clint didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered from Stanton to the woman, and then back again. "I'm not here to make trouble, Stanton. I'm here for answers. I've got questions about the Syndicate." The woman smirked, but Stanton raised a hand, silencing her. He stepped forward, closer to Clint, his eyes calculating. "Answers?" Stanton repeated, his voice low. "You came all this way for answers? I'd say you're wasting your time, Clint. The Syndicate doesn't take kindly to people who go looking for things they don't need to find." Clint's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "I'm not here to beg for answers. I'm here to make sure I don't regret asking." The tension in the room was thick, palpable, but Clint knew that the game had just begun. The Syndicate was watching, and they weren't about to let a man like Clint Eastwood get in their way. And neither was Lyall Stanton. The room seemed to close in around Clint, the weight of Stanton's presence heavy in the air. The woman beside him hadn't moved, her fingers still hovering just above her holstered pistol, but there was a coldness in her eyes, a quiet warning that said she wasn't afraid to pull the trigger if the situation demanded it. Clint's revolver remained steady in his hand, aimed squarely at the woman. He didn't want to pull the trigger, not yet, but he would if it came down to it. Stanton, however, was calm. Too calm. He smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching in something like amusement as he slowly lowered his hands, almost like he was testing Clint's resolve. "You're a brave man, Eastwood," Stanton said, his voice a smooth, almost predatory drawl. "Coming in here like this, knowing who I work for. But I have to ask, what do you think you're going to find by poking around in my business?" Clint didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Stanton's. "I'm not poking around. I'm asking questions. I want to know who you're working with, and I want to know why you've been causing trouble in my town." The woman's smirk widened, but Stanton raised his hand again, signaling her to hold her ground. "You've got a lot of nerve, Clint. I can appreciate that, but I don't have to answer to you. You're just another obstacle in the way of progress." "Progress?" Clint echoed, his voice growing colder. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding off of people who have no choice but to play along with your game." Stanton's smile flickered for a moment before he stepped forward, closing the distance between him and Clint. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm a parasite. But that doesn't mean I don't know how to survive in a world like this." Clint's eyes hardened. "I'm not interested in your survival story, Stanton. I'm interested in ending this." Stanton didn't flinch. Instead, he looked Clint up and down as though evaluating him, weighing whether this old gunslinger still had any fight left in him. "You're an interesting man, Eastwood," Stanton said after a long pause. "And I don't think you're a fool. You've been around long enough to know what happens when you go up against the Syndicate." Clint's grip on his revolver tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I've seen my fair share of trouble, Stanton. I'm not afraid of the Syndicate, and I'm not afraid of you. But I'd be a fool to think I could do this alone." There was a brief silence as Stanton considered Clint's words. The woman standing beside him, still poised and ready, was an enigma, a dangerous element who hadn't said a word since Clint had entered the room. Her silence wasn't lost on Clint. He could feel her watching him, waiting for the moment when she would have to act. But Stanton broke the silence, his smile returning, this time with a hint of something more calculating in his eyes. "You're right," Stanton said finally, his voice almost playful. "You can't do this alone, and neither can I. We could make a deal. We can help each other out." Clint didn't flinch, but his mind raced. He had been expecting this, the offer, the pull to join the other side. The question was whether Stanton was offering a deal because he thought Clint would back down, or because he feared him. "A deal?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "And what exactly would you want from me?" Stanton's eyes glinted with something almost predatory. "We can help you take down the Syndicate's enemies. I have influence, power. You name it. You're a man with a reputation. But you're also running out of time. The Syndicate's eyes are everywhere. If you want to get out alive, You'll need more than just your gun. Clint stayed silent, his gaze unwavering. He didn't trust Stanton, not one bit. But he also knew better than to make rash decisions, especially not in a room full of dangerous people. So, what's the catch? Clint asked, his voice cold. The catch, Stanton said, his smile widening, is that you'll owe me. And when the time comes, I'll expect you to return the favor. That's how these things work. Everyone's got a price. And you, Eastwood, are no exception. Clint's jaw tightened. He knew that no matter what deal Stanton was offering, it wouldn't be without strings attached. But at least this way, he could keep his enemies close. I don't make deals with people like you, Clint said slowly. You think you can control me, but you're wrong. If I work with you, it's on my terms. Stanton didn't flinch. Fair enough. But you're not in a position to make demands. Not anymore. And I think you know that. Clint's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, the woman beside Stanton spoke for the first time. Enough talk, she said in a voice that was cold and sharp. We don't have time for this. You can either join us or leave. But if you're planning to leave, I'd suggest you do it quickly. Clint's gaze shifted to her, his hand still on his revolver. The tension in the room thickened, but Clint wasn't about to make a move unless he had to. Stanton's voice cut through the silence. You'll come to understand, Eastwood. The Syndicate's reach is everywhere. You can't escape it. You'll either bend to it or be crushed beneath it. Make your choice. Clint didn't say anything for a long moment. He knew Stanton was right about one thing. The Syndicate was powerful, and if he was going to stand any chance of surviving this, he needed to play his cards carefully. He lowered his revolver slowly, the movement deliberate. The deal wasn't ideal, but it was a start. For now, I'm not joining your Syndicate, Clint said flatly, but I'll play along for now. Stanton's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good. We'll be in touch. And remember, Eastwood, there's no such thing as a free ride in this world. You'll pay your dues when the time comes. Clint turned toward the door, motioning for Sam to follow. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than words. As the door swung closed behind them, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a dangerous choice. But one thing was certain. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The Syndicate had made a mistake underestimating Clint Eastwood, and they were going to regret it. The night air was cool as Clint and Sam made their way out of the saloon, the sound of their boots echoing on the wooden boards of the creaking floor. Outside, the desert stretched out before them, the only sound the occasional whisper of wind across the dirt roads. The quiet felt unsettling, as though the entire town of Elmsford was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game Clint was only beginning to understand. Sam, who had been quiet since their conversation with Stanton, finally spoke as they crossed the street. What do we do now, Clint? He asked, his voice uncertain. You made a deal with them, but I don't like it. Clint didn't look at him right away. His eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the horizon as he lit a fresh cigar. The smoke curled into the night air, adding to the haze of uncertainty that had settled over him. He knew Sam was right. Making a deal with Stanton and the Syndicate was a dangerous game, but it was a game Clint knew how to play. For now, we wait, Clint replied, his voice gruff but calm. We do what they want, we gather information, and we make sure we know exactly who we're dealing with. Sam didn't respond immediately, but Clint could sense the unease in him. He had seen it before. The moment when the weight of the West, its violence and politics, started to get to a man. Sam wasn't a child anymore, but he still had a lot to learn about how the world worked. And Clint wasn't sure how much longer he could protect him from the dark side of it. I know it doesn't sit well with you, Sam, but right now, there's no other choice, Clint continued. We don't have the luxury of picking sides. Not until we've figured out exactly what the Syndicate's game is. The younger man nodded slowly, though his face remained clouded with doubt. I still don't like it. They're not people you can trust. Clint stopped walking and turned to face Sam. His eyes, dark as the desert night, locked onto the deputies. You're right. You can't trust them. But you have to understand something. The Syndicate isn't just about power. They play a longer game, and we're in the middle of it now. If we want to come out of this alive, we need to play by their rules. For a little while, Sam met Clint's gaze, but there was no softness in his eyes, only the sharp edge of someone who had begun to understand the complexity of the situation. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Sam finally spoke again, quieter this time. Then what happens when we find out everything we need to know? What happens after? Clint's expression didn't change. After, we do what we've always done. We fight, and we make sure the Syndicate learns that they made a mistake underestimating us. Sam nodded, but Clint could see the unease still lingering in his eyes. Sam wasn't ready for what was coming. Not yet. Clint wasn't sure anyone could be. The two of them didn't speak much more as they made their way out of Elmsford. The town was behind them now, swallowed up by the night, and the open desert stretched ahead like an endless sea of possibilities, all of them dangerous. They rode until they reached a small, abandoned homestead, a place Clint had used as a temporary hideout in the past. It was far enough from town to keep them out of sight, but close enough to return quickly if things went wrong. They set up camp for the night, the small fire crackling in the distance, casting long shadows across the land. Clint sat by the fire, his mind racing as he thought over the deal he had made. The Syndicate was a machine that controlled far more than Clint had realized when he first stepped into Elmsford. And now, he was a part of it, whether he liked it or not. But Clint wasn't one to let anyone control him, not even the Syndicate. He took a long drag from his cigar, the embers glowing in the night. His thoughts were interrupted by Sam, who was sitting nearby, staring into the fire. "Clint," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the question he had been holding in. "You said we needed to play by their rules, but do you really think we can beat them?" Clint took a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've fought worse than the Syndicate, Sam. They might have power, but power isn't everything. Not when you've got the right people on your side." Sam looked up, meeting Clint's eyes in the dim light. "And you think we've got the right people?" Clint's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "We've got the only people we need. We just have to make sure we use them the right way." There was a moment of silence as Sam considered Clint's words. Then the young deputy nodded slowly. "All right, I'm with you. We'll do it your way." Clint didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sam had made his choice, and that was all Clint could ask for. As the night settled in, Clint kept his vigil. The sound of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote filled the air, but Clint's mind was focused on something else. The Syndicate was powerful, but they had their weaknesses. Everyone did. It was just a matter of finding them. And when Clint found those weaknesses, he wasn't going to stop until he tore the Syndicate apart from the inside out. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were filled with a tense quiet. Clint and Sam spent their time preparing, gathering information on the Syndicate and its network. They moved in the shadows, meeting with old allies and contacts that Clint had made over the years. Men and women who had dealt with the darker side of the West and lived to tell about it. Each one had their own piece of the puzzle, but none of them seemed to know the whole picture. The Syndicate was a web of corruption, its reach extending far beyond what Clint had imagined. Every day that passed felt like another step deeper into dangerous territory, but Clint had long since learned that there was no going back once you were in. Sam, despite his initial hesitation, had become more focused in their search. Clint could see the determination in his eyes, the willingness to follow through on the promise he'd made. But Clint also knew that Sam was still trying to reconcile the man he wanted to be with the harsh reality of the West. Finally, they got the break they needed. It came in the form of a man named Mark Holbrook, a former member of the Syndicate's inner circle who had fallen out of favor when he had crossed the wrong people. Clint had known Holbrook years ago, back when the man had still been part of the law enforcement system. But when the Syndicate had come calling, Holbrook had made the mistake of refusing their offer. Now, he was a fugitive, hiding in plain sight. Holbrook was hiding out in a small cabin at the edge of a mountain pass, and Clint knew that if anyone had the answers they needed, it was him. The journey to find him was long and fraught with danger. Clint could feel the weight of every step, the growing tension that seemed to follow them. Every shadow felt like a potential threat. The night they arrived at Holbrook's cabin, the air was colder than usual, the stars shining brighter than ever. It was an eerie stillness that had settled over the land, like the calm before the storm. Sam dismounted first, scanning the area with a wary eye. "You think he'll be willing to talk?" he asked, his voice low. Clint nodded, adjusting his hat. "He's got no choice. Either he helps us, or he dies. That's how this works now." The two of them moved toward the cabin, their footsteps soft on the dirt path. They didn't speak much, knowing that every word could give away their position. When they reached the door, Clint motioned for Sam to step back. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the still night. There was a long pause, and then the door creaked open slightly, revealing Holbrook's wary face. The man looked older than Clint remembered, his eyes hard and mistrusting. "What do you want?" Holbrook's voice was rough, his hand gripping a rifle that was slung over his shoulder. "I need information," Clint said simply. "The Syndicate. I need to know how deep they've gone, who's in charge, and what they're planning." Holbrook's eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't lower the rifle. "You don't know what you're asking, Eastwood. The Syndicate. They'll kill you if they find out you're poking around. You'd be better off leaving this alone." Clint's expression hardened. "I don't leave things alone, Holbrook. Not when people's lives are at stake." Holbrook hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and something stronger. The place was sparsely furnished, with a small stove in the corner and a couple of chairs around a rough-hewn table. Holbrook lowered his rifle, but kept his eyes on Clint as he took a seat. "You're not going to like what I tell you," Holbrook said, his voice low. "But if you're serious about this, I'll tell you what I know." Clint took a seat across from him, his gaze never leaving Holbrook's face. "Tell me everything." Holbrook leaned forward, rubbing his face. "The Syndicate's bigger than you think. They've got people everywhere, lawmen, politicians, business owners. And the man running it all, his name's Bartholomew Wade. He's a ghost. No one knows where he came from, but he's got connections that stretch across the entire country. He's been pulling strings from the shadows for years." Clint absorbed the information, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Bartholomew Wade. The name sounded like the kind of man who would bury his enemies in silence, never leaving a trace behind. The kind of man who could destroy entire towns and never raise a finger. "And what's his plan?" Clint asked. Holbrook shook his head. "I don't know the full extent of it, but I know this. He's been buying up land, securing railroads, and moving pieces into place like a chess game. But it's not about money. It's about power. He's planning something big, something that will change the entire balance of the West." Clint's jaw tightened. "How do I stop him?" Holbrook leaned back in his chair, a look of resignation in his eyes. "You don't. Not alone. Wade's got more men, more resources than you can imagine. The only way to stop him is to hit him where it hurts. Take out his people, one by one, and make sure he knows it's coming." Clint sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the information settle. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now he had a target, a man who could be taken down. He just had to figure out how. "We'll need more help," Clint said finally. "You in?" Holbrook's eyes flickered with doubt. "You're asking me to fight the Syndicate again? You think I'd risk my life for that?" Clint's gaze was unflinching. "You don't have a choice. The Syndicate's coming for all of us, Holbrook. If we don't stand together, we'll all fall." Holbrook stared at Clint for a long moment before he sighed. "All right, I'm in. But don't expect me to lead the charge. I'm just here to help you take them down." Clint nodded, a small sense of resolve settling into his chest. "Then we start by taking out their leaders, one at a time." As Clint and Sam prepared to leave Holbrook's cabin, the weight of what lay ahead was clear. The Syndicate had controlled the West for far too long, and Clint Eastwood was about to bring the fight straight to their doorstep. The reckoning was coming, and the Syndicate wouldn't know what hit them. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.